My name is Felipe Rojas. I am a professor of archaeology at the Tchaikovsky Institute and in the Department of Egyptology and Ancient Western Ancient Studies. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce Christopher Ratté, who comes to us from the University of Michigan, where he is a professor in the Department of Classical Studies and History of Art and the director of IPCAAA, the Interdepartmental Program in Classical Art and Archaeology. Professor Ratté is well known in our field for his extensive work on Western Anatolia. After more than a decade of fieldwork at Sardis, he served for many years as a co-director of NYU's Aphrodisias excavation and then directed the Aphrodisias Regional Survey. A recent flurry of books, including Lydian Architecture, Aphrodisias Papers 4 and 5, as well as Archaeology and the Cities of Asia Minor and Late Antiquity, attests to his intimate knowledge of the region. Those volumes are evidence of his passionate and rigorous scholarship. But that is only part of the story, for he is also a fiercely imaginative dirt archaeologist and an exceptionally generous teacher. I would know, for even though our formal academic bonds were severed at the very beginning of my graduate career, he has variously guided, encouraged, scolded, informed, promoted, and prodded me academically ever since, even acting as my dissertation advisor, although there is no document to prove it. I have learned more from him in the field than I have from anyone else, and I very much regret that I could not join him in his ventures in the land of Medea. It is precisely about his recent work in Georgia that Chris will be talking to us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Christopher Ratté.
Thank you, Felipe. That's great. So I'm going to talk today about an archaeological survey project that lasted from 2009 through 2011, so for just 3 seasons, a relatively short-term project that was sponsored by the University of Michigan and the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. But I'm also going to talk more generally about archaeology in Georgia on the assumption that few in this audience are intimately familiar with the problems that face archaeology at this moment in Georgia, and they're rich and interesting and found all around the Black Sea region, especially in the former Soviet sphere. So I'm going to begin by talking about the landscape and history of Georgia. Then I'll talk about the archaeological tradition of the country before moving on to our specific project and the problems it was designed to address. So this obviously is to give you a sense globally where Georgia is situated. Here's a map that shows Georgia in the context of Central Asia, sandwiched in between Turkey and Russia. We'll talk a little bit about the presence of Russia in the intellectual life of Georgia momentarily. First, a few pictures that give you a better sense of its landscape. So a topographical map that shows the mountains of the Caucasus here and the Lesser Caucasus or Pontic Alps. So these mountains that separate Georgia from Russia and these that separate Georgia from Turkey. I'll be focusing on this region here, the triangular lowlands that define the territory of ancient Colchis, bordering obviously on the Black Sea. Colchis is separated by a kind of intermediate mountain range here called the Liki Range from eastern Georgia, which is where the modern capital, Tbilisi, is situated. And I'll show you just a few pictures of one archaeological site in that region. First, some images to give you a sense of the very rich and varied landscape. It's really a place of extremes of Georgia. So here we are at one of the rivers that flows into the Black Sea. In Kutaisi, which is the second city of Georgia, with a population of about 300,000, the largest city in the territory of Colchis, and this is the place that is most likely to have been remembered in tradition as Aya, the kingdom of the capital of the kingdom of ancient Colchis, whether or not that actually existed. It's a really remarkable town today, exhibiting this fascinating blend of medieval tradition and Soviet-era Plattenbau. So Kutaisi is right about here. I'm going to show you now a picture which is taken from the mountains of the Lesser Caucasus, looking across the plain of the river Phasis. That's the river from which the word pheasant takes its name. The Phasian bird is the pheasant, and that's the only word that survives from the ancient language of Colchis into modern English anyway. So here we are looking across the Phasis River plain from the Lesser Caucasus to the Greater Caucasus, just to give you some sense of how really small this place is. And if we were to go directly north, we would get to these mountains. So this is one of the typical mountains of the Caucasus. And on my first year in Georgia, I hired a guide to take me. We walked from this town, which is called Medea, up to this point right here. So bear that in mind. That's what you see when you get up to that point and you look, just a land of nothing but rock and snow and ice. Whereas the picture on the left is from where I showed you that earlier view looking across the plain to the mountain. So these places I did measure this on Google Earth earlier today. These places are exactly 100 kilometers apart. These pictures were taken at the same time of the year. So that just gives you a sense of the extreme character of the landscape. So let's now talk a little bit about the archaeology first of Colchis and then of Georgia more generally. And I'll show you pictures of some settlement mounds near Kobe, a coastal site near Pichvenari. The largest modern town is Kobuleti. And then a place called Sikia Gora, which is not very far from Tbilisi, the modern capital. It's first possible to talk about Colchian material culture beginning in the late Bronze Age. So let's say in the mid-second millennium BC. This is when when there emerges what you can define as a sort of a set of cultural attributes that are recognizable in mound sites, platform mounds, in the Colchian lowlands, a certain pottery tradition, and also metallurgical traditions in both bronze and iron. The metals are represented largely by hoards of axes and also agricultural implements like hoes. And then settlements are represented by these mounds, which look a lot like the settlement mounds of the regions to the south of Michigan. That is to say, there's a lot of similarity with woodlands culture in the United States, as we'll see. There are interestingly no graves associated with these settlement mounds. So our knowledge of by and large, our knowledge of Colchian culture is based on the settlements on the one hand, the hoards on the other. That changes in the first millennium, as we'll see. So that was just a picture of a typical Colchian settlement mound, which is now occupied by a modern cemetery. Makes it difficult to excavate, but very useful in that there are small-scale excavations going on all the time, which generate pottery. So you can hang around the mound and pick up artifacts that way. Just for the sake of comparison, this is the wonderfully named Mounds State Park in Ohio, with mound complexes which are very similar to what we see in Colchis. And this is a theme that I'll return to, the utility of Americanist archaeology in the exploration of Colchis, both conceptually and in terms of technologies like how to detect wattle and daub structures through geophysical survey, not something I learned very much about in Sardis and Aphrodisias, but my colleagues at Michigan have been quite helpful in guiding me through the interpretation of some of the things we found in Colchis. A few more of these mound settlements. Now, as you all know, modern Georgia exists, as it were, in the shadow of Russia, and has been in the shadow of Russia for centuries now. It's very difficult not to think of Colchis as a borderland, a place, as I said before, sandwiched in between greater powers to the north and south. And that was true in antiquity too, although the centers of gravity were situated in different places. So not to the north in Russia, but to the southwest, or to the west and southwest in the Mediterranean world, and to the southeast in the ancient Near East. So a couple of maps from the wonderful Historische Weltatlas. This one showing, the sort of traditional view of Greek colonization, and the easternmost of the recognized Greek colonies, the farthest shore in Greek mythology is, ancient Phasis. And that was that's not a site that's been discovered, so it's in fact very difficult to talk about Greek colonization in Georgia. But there are excavations on the Pontic coast of Georgia which have yielded very rich information for interaction with the Greek world. And perhaps the best known of those is Pitchvanari, which is situated just to the south, about 50 kilometers south of where we think Phasis was, where modern Poti is. And there are excavations that have been going on there under the direction of Amiran Kakidze and Michael Vickers for a long time. Fascinating excavation process. They basically clear off the vegetation, and then they take these big kind of wooden rakes and they just rake across the sand. And they see the discoloration of the earth tells them where the graves are. They're basically just excavating a cemetery. And then they scoop out the graves. Everything is interred in the sand. Absolutely, there's no skeletal material preserved at all. The nature of the soil and the groundwater has completely destroyed the skeletal remains, but the pottery is quite well preserved, and that has generated all sorts of interesting hypotheses about, the hybrid character of this community. So that's the Greek side, and then looking to the Near East, the Achaemenid Empire pushed up against the southern boundary, natural boundary of Colchis, and according to Herodotus, Colchis was a sort of tributary state, not a satrapy, not governed by the Persians, but a place that recognized Persian overlordship. Whether or not it's that simple, we'll discuss. But there is lots of archaeological evidence, again, for close interaction with the Achaemenid sphere. And here is the site that I pointed out on the map, and I'll remind you where it is on the map in a moment, of Tsikia Gora, which is one of a number of settlements of the mid-first millennium BC that exhibit very strong Achaemenid components, most notably in the presence of what look like Achaemenid fire temples. So this is some sort of a kind of, sanctum sanctorum here with a big open-air altar in front of it that occupies a prominent place within a fortified citadel. Of great interest to the Georgians in particular are these ancillary spaces, one of which was apparently a kind of a mill. So each one of these little objects here is a grinding stone, and they're still actually in situ, so there's just this long row of grinding stones. Of even greater interest is this one with all of these great big jars buried in the ground. This is thought to be a wine cellar. The Georgians feel that wine was a Georgian invention. And it is in fact possible that the word oinos, which you know is not an Indo-European word, does originate in the Caucasus. So here is the fire temple, and here is the, so they're still there, all these mortars and grinding stones. And then this is the area of the putative wine cellar. So archaeology in Georgia was very generously supported by the Soviet Union when Georgia was part of the Soviet Union. There was an Institute of Archaeology which was part of the Georgian Academy of Sciences. It had a permanent staff of researchers. It had about up to 100 researchers. It had a series of archaeological stations spread around the country, which acted as kind of regional headquarters for local archaeological projects. It has a very, very rich tradition of scholarly publication in the Georgian language, as well, of course, as in Russian. On my first visit to Georgia, or my second visit, my first real season of research there, the director of the Georgian National Museum asked our team to do a geophysical survey of a site near Gori, which is the birthplace of Stalin. And we were put up in one of these archaeological stations. And I just want to show you a few pictures of that to give you some sense of what's happened to archaeology in Georgia since the fall of the Soviet Union. So this is the archaeological station of Sahni. You know, when it was a hub of activity, it had a dining room. It had laboratory spaces for the study and storage of artifacts, and they're all still there in greater or lesser states of disrepair. Note the skull on the desk here. It's completely empty except for one caretaker who used to be a research scientist at the Institute of Archaeology, and they now have a third to a quarter of the staff they had in the Soviet period. This guy was at least kept on as the caretaker of this place. He keeps it in relatively clean. There were foxes living there when we stayed there, but all things considered, it could have been worse. He doesn't update the calendar. Here's the calendar, and here's a detail of it. And note the year. That's the calendar before everything fell apart. So the collapse of the Soviet Union was a huge blow to Georgian archaeology. The Georgians have much less money. They're cut off from Russian technology. It's really, I have huge admiration for our colleagues there who are really trying their best to maintain some tradition of archaeological research in the face of terrible difficulties. There are some, there are some benefits to the collapse of the Soviet Union and a different kind of integration into the wider world for archaeology as well as in other respects in Georgia. One is pipeline construction. As you know, this is a complicated part of the world. So if you want to get oil from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, you can't go from Baku, which is the main terminal, to Armenia because they're at war. And even if you couldn't go from Armenia to Turkey either because they don't get along. So Georgia, fortunately, is the one place that you can route the pipeline through from Azerbaijan into Georgia, then skipping over Armenia, and then down into Turkey to the Mediterranean. And British Petroleum has paid for a great deal of archaeological investigation associated with the construction mainly of this big pipeline, but also of smaller pipelines too, leading to the Black Sea ports. And that's done according to international standards. British Petroleum, supports archaeological research in many parts of the world, and they, they have to wear hard hats. They have to produce Harris matrices. They have to do things that that otherwise wouldn't be happening in this country. And of course, there's a lot of money, and they pay well. So that's one thing. The other thing that is a change, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, is the prominence of the Georgian National Museum in the archaeology of the country, and its various efforts at international outreach. So when after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Academy of Sciences in Georgia became a shadow of its former self, and the Institute of Archaeology was dissolved. It was then reconstituted under the aegis of the Georgian National Museum. So the way that I got involved in the archaeology of Georgia is rather serendipitous. I had just left NYU for Michigan. I was just finishing up a survey project at Aphrodisias in which Felipe participated, and which has just been published with a very brilliant contribution by Felipe. And the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, which you all know about at NYU, was just being created, and it had a gallery space, but no collection, and they wanted to have a show. Early on, to sort of, establish the role of the exhibition space in the Institute. And there happened to be a show that had first gone to Europe and then come to America to the Smithsonian. It was going to the Smithsonian and the Getty on the golden graves of ancient Vani, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the ISA was able to, hijack this, bring it to New York. It was actually a great thing because they worked with the conservators at the Metropolitan Museum to treat some of the objects in the show, which was a big benefit. And so in very short order was able to have a quite spectacular exhibition in this new exhibition space. But there was a quid pro quo. The Georgians wanted some kind of involvement in Georgian archaeology in return. They got the conservation from the Metropolitan Museum, and they got a field project. And the other thing about the ISA is they didn't have any faculty yet. But I was a familiar face, so this opportunity just fell in my lap. To go and do a very, very different kind of archaeology from anything that I had done, in decades. I mean, I did actually, my first archaeological excavations were in the Americas, initially in the Southwest, in the Anasazi sphere, and then in Mesoamerica. But that had been a long time ago, and it had been a long time since I had dealt with, pit features and wattle and daub architecture. So let's now turn to Vani, and I'll tell you a little bit about the history of this site and about the history of archaeological research at the site, and then I'll talk about our project. So as you see, the site is situated in the foothills of the Lesser Caucasus, so on the southern edge of the Phasis River plain, not too far from Kutaisi, which is right about here. This is a picture from the Phasis River plain looking toward Vani, which is right here. This building is the museum at Vani, which was built in the 1970s to house the finds from the excavations. And you see the mountains of the Lesser Caucasus in the background. Otar Lord-Kipanidze was the director of the center, the Institute of Archaeology at the Georgian Academy of Sciences. He was also a professor at Tbilisi State University, and he was the director of the Vani excavations. And he ruled over Georgian archaeology as a very benevolent despot for decades. In fact, his son, David Lord-Kipanidze, is the director of the Georgian National Museum now. So that's part of the reason why the Georgian National Museum has an ongoing interest in Vani. Vani is a place that first attracted the attention of archaeologists in the 19th century because of precious metal artifacts that were literally washing out of the hillside and cropping up whenever people, dug, not whenever, but on a number of occasions when, for new road cuts and the construction of basements and digging ditches for pipes and so on. There are newspaper reports of golden artifacts being found at Vani in the late 19th century, and there have been excavations going on there for about 50 years now. So they weren't started by Lord-Kipanidze, they were started by somebody else, but he took them over in the 1960s. The site covers an area of about 6 hectares, about 2 hectares of which has been explored, and that's obvious from the parts that are filled in solid here. What's not shown in this drawing is that there are still modern houses over the unexplored parts of the site. So that has both inhibited archaeological exploration, but also preserved the remains underneath the soil. It's celebrated for 2 things. One, its rich graves, and 2, its monumental architecture. Speaking relatively, of course, for Colchis. So basically, I'll just essentially the site. There are fortifications that run around like this and continue around like this. And then within those fortifications, I'm going to show you pictures of this area here, which is a cemetery area, and this building here, which is a monumental structure that may be some kind of a palatial residence, identified by the excavator as a temple. And I'll show you this structure right here, which is a part of the fortifications. So here are the graves. They're essentially pit graves, so they're dug into the natural soil, covered with low mounds of rocks, so sort of mini tumuli. Inside of them were placed large wooden cists, or like coffins, and some of them are big graves with lots of grave goods. So just to interpret this one, you have obviously a pair of horses, 3 horses here, and then a number of human internments arranged in a kind of a pattern here. So 5 bodies here, and 1 here and 1 here. It's hard to know exactly what was going on here, but the assumption is that most of the people buried here, as well as the horses, were sacrificed on the occasion of the internment of some prominent person. So perhaps the person in the middle is the person whose tomb this is, and the other bodies are those of his attendants. And then, of course, just a taste of the golden objects, which include most of these are parts of clothing, so beads and other things that were sewed onto cloaks, but there are also gold and silver vessels, bronze vessels, pottery vessels, in some cases tombs with literally thousands of small gold objects. So they're reminiscent, of course, of the kurgans of Siberia. So that's one set of these tombs. Now let's just look at some of the architecture. So here is the gate, or the tower flanking one of the gates into the fortification. Some other objects from various contexts. Bronze inscription in Greek. Difficult to read, apparently a sacred law with lots of names. Bronze sculpture, mainly small-scale figurines, but one large-scale figure, some sort of votive, perhaps. And big buildings apart from the fortification. So this is a large structure with stone foundations, mud brick on top. You know, interestingly restored in the Soviet era. So these are not reinforced. They're concrete mud bricks, you know, that were put on there to, you know, protect the stone foundations. And in this place, the original mud brick superstructure was maintained and roofed over, and it's slowly melting away. The the site of Vani was interpreted more or less along the following lines by Lord Kipanidze. So let me back up and say a little bit about how Georgian archaeology has traditionally conceived of you know, Colchian society in the late second and first millennium BC. And what are our sources of information? Well, we do have some information besides archaeology, in the form of texts, both Greek and Near Eastern, that talk about the Colchians, and traditions, especially associated with the story of Medea, that talk about Colchis as a kingdom. So there's that kind of general tradition, and then there is some more specific data which comes in particular from Strabo, you know, writing, as you know, at the end of the first millennium, who talks about the division of Colchis in his time into regions which he calls skeptukes, so ruled over by scepter bearers. To make a long story short, the way these disparate sources of textual information have been put together is to tell a story of the emergence of a Colchian kingdom in the late Bronze and early Iron Age. You know, along the analogy, if we were to look for Anatolian parallels with the emergence of the Phrygian kingdom, for example. So the emergence of a Colchian kingdom centered at Kutaisi, ancient Aya, that in the course of the first millennium BC developed a complex network of connections with the Mediterranean world via Greek colonization of the Black Sea and with the ancient Near East via relations with the Achaemenid Empire, until the region was conquered by Mithridates of Pontus toward the end of the first millennium BC, and then conquered by the Romans, in fact by none other than Pompey the Great at the end of the first millennium BC. So this is, you know, in a nutshell, the picture that if you go on the internet, where I got this map, and Google, you know, Wikipedia, you will, or Google Colchis, look it up in Wikipedia, you'll get, you know, this is the story that will be told. Where does Vani fit in this story? Well, Strabo mentions a place that was the sanctuary of a goddess called Leucothea, and he describes this as a kind of temple city. Again, I guess the analogy would be in Pontus, which is where Strabo was from. Places like Comana, the sanctuaries that date back to the Persian period. So a kind of, sacred town. And according to Strabo, this place was destroyed by Mithridates and then destroyed again by the Romans. And there are two destruction levels of more or less the same period at Sahni. Lord Kipanidze identified this as this, sanctuary of Leucothea. And that's if you read the catalog to, the show that I saw and went around, that's how the site is described in the text. One of the interesting things about the archaeology of Sahni is that no traces of settlement have been identified in the archaeological record. So only these graves and the fortifications and these various monumental buildings. And that's taken to corroborate the hypothesis that, well, this is not a population center, but a site of some other character. However, Lord Kipanidze also suggested that it had a kind of economic and administrative control over the surrounding territory that was based in particular on trade, so on control of trade with the Mediterranean world via the Black Sea. Now, this is a rich series of hypotheses that provide fertile ground for thought and challenges to researchers working in this region. So, what were we trying to do, when we got involved in this survey project? Well, in the most general sense, to find a way of thinking about Sahni differently, and to do that by using techniques of archaeological investigation which hadn't been explored at Sahni previously, or more generally in Georgia. There is not the kind of tradition of archaeological survey in Georgia that there is in the Mediterranean world. So the idea was that, well, we could do a new kind of research, and that would provide a good way of rethinking a lot of these earlier hypotheses. What kind of a settlement was Sahni? Was it is the reason that settlement was not residential housing hasn't been identified at the settlement simply because it wasn't built out of stone, for example? Is it possible that there, in fact, it was densely inhabited, but in a way that had not been recognized in the archaeological record? Is there any reason to think, apart from the traditions of the Greek and Near Eastern traditions, or really the way modern scholars have interpreted those traditions, to think that Colchis was a state on the model of places like Phrygia and Lydia? Or is it possible that we should be thinking about other models of social organization that don't privilege cities and the way the Greek models do? I want to make it very clear. Now I'm going to go and tell you about our research. So I want to make it very clear that we had no ambitions of solving the problem of Colchian social organization through one short-term archaeological survey project. We're not going to answer all of those questions I've just been asking you through the relatively limited, although very concentrated, research that we carried out. But our hope was more that we would test out strategies of research that, if more generally applied throughout Colchis, might really make a difference to the way that that Colchian society is understood. And just to give it away, I mean, obviously, I think probably most of you have already figured this out. And it pains me as a classical archaeologist to admit this, but the literary sources are completely useless to understanding Colchian society. So what Strabo tells us, what we learn from traditions about Medea and so on, it just all has to be set aside, and we really have to start over from the archaeology, because that's our only reliable source of information. And so our hope was that collecting, a sort of a different data set from survey would be a useful step in that direction. Okay, so here's a map that shows the situation of Vani in relation to the Phasis River here and the mountains of the Lesser Caucasus. Now, when I said that there was no tradition of archaeological survey in Georgia, that's true in one sense, in the sense that there's no tradition of systematic survey, or there isn't there wasn't before the fall of the Soviet Union the kinds of systematic archaeological survey that is well established in the Mediterranean and American spheres. That doesn't mean that people hadn't gone out and explored archaeological sites in the region. There was a very, very rich tradition of what we would call informal archaeological survey, especially around Vani. So the excavators at Vani had regularly gone on field trips to the surrounding villages, looking for traces of earlier habitation. And there was a kind of a rich but loosely organized body of knowledge that we could begin with. And in many respects, I would say that our project was really not about finding new things, but about taking existing knowledge and incorporating that into a systematic, conceptual and technological framework. Georgian archaeology has great strengths. The archaeologists of this region know the material culture very well. They're very skilled excavators in difficult archaeological circumstances. They're very good at digging these waterlogged sites. Up through the 1970s, they had access they were doing geophysical prospection using Soviet technology, so they were quite developed. And of course, the Soviet sphere was quite sophisticated in its kind of materialist approach to economic history and ways of using archaeological information to investigate things like slavery and so on that classical archaeologists didn't think so much about in those days. But having said that, obviously, Georgian archaeologists in the Soviet period, and certainly in the post-Soviet years, haven't participated in the kinds of current debates that figure large in contemporary archaeology, having to do with state formation, rethinking colonialism, for example. And they haven't benefited from the kinds of technological developments that are standard now in archaeological research. So remote sensing, geographical information systems and things like that. So a lot of what we were doing was simply taking, information that was there, revisiting sites that had been identified previously, but mapping them, documenting them, collecting artifacts in a systematic fashion, carrying out where it seemed as if it would be worthwhile geophysical prospection, and in a few cases following that up with excavation. Obviously, we, in all archaeological surveys, we focused on, we were, looking at information from all periods, so from the early Bronze Age through the medieval, but we were particularly interested in archaeological information about the emerging social complexity of this region in the first millennium BC. That was our, kind of research focus. So here's just an example of what we started with. So this is a map that was made in the 1970s of medieval fortifications and church buildings in the region around Vani. This is the Phasis River right here. Vani is situated here. These are the various tributary streams of the Phasis. And each of these marks a location of some medieval or early modern site. And what we found, not surprisingly, is that in many cases these were situated in the same locations as evidence for ancient habitation. So here's our project. In the first year, we were a relatively small team, totally dependent on our Georgian collaborator, Guram Kfirkvelia here, and our driver, Soso, and his ancient Ukrainian UAZ 69, which is the the Russian or the Soviet version of a Jeep. And I'm just going to show you some pictures of the different situations that we examined. So we examined an area relatively confined of 15 kilometers with Vani at the center, and then so 7 to 8 kilometers on one side, 7 to 8 kilometers on the other side, and then going about 5 kilometers up into the foothills of the Lesser Caucasus. We did do some work in the Phasis River Plain, but that has been completely scoured by regular flooding, and so there's and we were able to use one of the pipeline trenches as a kind of as a sort of a guide. There's really no trace of habitation in the plain in this region. So we focused on the foothills of the Lesser Caucasus. So this is a picture from one of the places where we documented an archaeological site looking out toward the plain. A typical view from the plain looking at these foothills. So we studied the foothills. We studied the tributary streams that run through the foothills up into up to about 1,000 meters above sea level as you approach the Caucasus Mountains, one of the lovely mountain streams, and informal survey. Dependent, as I say, on Georgian goodwill, sometimes rather hindered by Georgian goodwill. We came to run from men bearing bottles of clear liquid because because that would completely wreck a day. And I'm just going to zero in on the region right around Vani and show you in particular a few pictures of this site right here at Shuamta. So just to give you a sense of how our research progressed through one example. So Shuamta was a place where the archaeologists at Vani had been shown pottery and other artifacts in the fields around the village in the 1970s and 80s, and they were actually planning to do some exploratory trenches in this area when the Soviet Union collapsed, and so did the archaeological establishment. Here's a picture that shows Shuamta. Vani is situated right here, and more generally, the territory of our survey. So this is the field that yielded the artifacts that drew us to the site. So we, like all modern survey archaeologists, we carried our GPS, receivers wherever we went, turned on so that we have a track of our or record of every place we visited. So this is the road that we drove along, and here is where we stopped to look at this particular archaeological site. By the way, all of these maps I'm showing you are based on two sources of information. One are Russian military maps, which have been digitized by entrepreneurs, Georgian entrepreneurs in Tbilisi, probably for the use of the oil companies, and then Iconos satellite imagery brought into to a GIS. So A33 is where the field with the artifacts you're about to see is situated, and A34 is where there is a medieval watchtower on the top of a hill overlooking the modern village of Shumamta. Here's the location of the watchtower. Obviously, surface survey is not easy in these conditions, especially not in June when we were there. One of my students is doing an intensive survey there now, and he is following the advice of our Georgian colleagues, which is to go there in March, before the grass is 2 feet tall everywhere. This is the remains of this medieval watchtower. And here's the field that we focused on, so freshly plowed. And you can see very clearly bits of burnt daub here. Just for those of you who aren't familiar with this or need a refresher, as I did when we started working here, this is what wattle and daub construction looks like, and also other kinds of timber and mud construction. When buildings like this burn, obviously the clay part gets fired, and it often preserves traces of the beams, the logs or the reeds, the wooden components of the construction that give you some sense of, well, what kind of construction are you dealing with. Examples of log cabins from New Harmony, Indiana. I took this picture on the same trip where we went to Mound State Park. My wife is an architect, and we had just moved to Michigan, and we decided we would take a family vacation, which we called Mounds and Modern Buildings, which Leo and his sister thought was a really raw deal, but we enjoyed. So obviously timber and mud. So there's the daub, and here are some of the artifacts that we picked up on our first visit to this site. So pottery, chipstone, mostly pottery that fits very well into the Colchian tradition, but also black glaze pottery that clearly represents either Greek imports or pottery made in emulation of Greek pottery. In the aerial photograph here, we have been looking at this region right here. So this is the hill crowned by the watchtower, and these are two fields that we decided we would follow up with geophysical prospection. This is the first one here that I showed you the pictures of before. And here is, we did first magnetic survey, and then we followed that with electrical resistivity testing. And here are the maps of those two fields. This one had been used as a fruit orchard, and so these are the lines of the plowing and the planting for the fruit orchard, which obscured any traces of subsurface habitation. So that was a bust. But this field was much more interesting. There's this road that runs right through it. We were quite enthused about this until it occurred to us to ask, a local villager who said, yes, we used that road, until about 30 years ago, and then we covered it up. But in addition to the road are these circular features, which are aligned in some kind of a row up here, and some down here. So we then targeted these for excavation. Here is one of our students, Yana Mokrushova, helping to lay out a trench. We laid out the trenches incidentally. We didn't have any surveying instruments, so we did everything with our GeoXT, field computers, field computers with their built-in, GPS receivers, and that worked extremely well in basically finding where we were and laying out our trenches. When we documented the trenches, we then did bring in a surveyor, land surveyor from Tbilisi, who produced this contour map. So here's the situation of our excavations. And I'm just going to show you a few pictures of this one, and this one. So let's start with this one. This is what it looked like on the GeoSurvey map, and here's what it looked like in the trench. And you see that it really worked, laying out the trench with our GeoXT. And it's a circular pit, and it's partially filled with large lumps of burnt daub and also potsherds and other kinds of debris. So we sectioned the pit. You can see that one half of it here, but you can see very clearly in the soil after a rainfall, where the outlines of the pit are. Pit features at various North Pontic sites. I was initially, attracted to the idea that this was could have been some kind of a pit structure or storage feature. However, there were no post holes in the base of the pit, and when I talked about this with one of my colleagues, Robin Beck at the University of Michigan, who's now working at Cahokia, he had another interpretation, which I'll get to in a moment. First, pictures of another one of these cut features. So here are the outlines of it. And here is obviously the debris. That's this one over here. And this one up here, we did not excavate. We simply cleared off the topsoil to see the fill of the cut feature. Here's another small pit. And here's a close-up that shows the burnt daub, and you can actually see the lines of the reed that this mud was attached to in some of the pottery. Views of the pottery. This is very characteristic of the early first millennium BC in Colchis. So typically dated to the 8th or 7th centuries. Of course, that dating is conjectural. We know that it predates the appearance of the first Greek imports, which come in the 6th century. We know it's later than pottery from some of the settlement mounds, where there are very well preserved timbers that have yielded good radiocarbon dates. We don't have a very tight hold over the chronology of Colchian pottery between, let's say, the mid-2nd millennium BC and the early 1st millennium BC, but this seems to come at the end of that period. So, as I say, typically dated to the 8th or 7th centuries. And these are stylized animal heads on these handles. In some cases, they have horns. They look very much clearly like animal heads. Very typical Colchian pottery. Figurines of types which are also very characteristic for these layers. So Robin Beck, when I talked about these, and showed him pictures of these pits, said basically, they're too small to be pit houses. They're too small, they're too irregular, and you don't have any traces of post holes, so they must be something else. And his idea was that they're actually quarry pits for the mud that's going to be used in wattle and daub architecture, probably a little further up the hill, and they're filled then with debris, which is basically sheet layers, or that has washed down from further up the hill. So I think that's I think that's a much more satisfactory explanation than the ones we were able to come up with. That's just an example of how it's been very useful to have archaeologists in a strong anthropology department to consult with. So what have we gotten out of this project? In a nutshell, I'm going to say two things. One is that the data that we've collected and the way that we have organized it suggests to us that while it is clear that Vani is exceptional in a regional context, so it's exceptionally rich, it's one of a number of comparable sites. So there are other sites, especially to the west of Vani, that exhibit on a smaller scale the same features that Vani does, especially comparably rich tombs, but also shall we say, large-scale, log cabin style architecture. And there's no evidence for the kinds of things that Lord Kipanidze hypothesized, such as a system of territorial fortifications associated with Vani. He had identified these buildings that were found in sites apart from Vani as fortifications. They don't seem to be that. They seem to be structures like the ones that have been found at Vani, but on a smaller scale. So there's no evidence for territorial defenses. There's no evidence, there's no clear indication of economic control of the region by Vani. There is a hierarchy of settlements. So Vani is at the top of that hierarchy locally, and then there are places that are like Vani but on a smaller scale, and then there is evidence for habitation in other contexts which seems to be much more dispersed and scattered. I should say that I know I've already run over time, but I should say that our student Ryan Hughes, whom I mentioned before as a student who's working now in Vani, has developed and executed a project of intensive survey of a part of this survey area to make sure. I mean, obviously, we went to these places where there were medieval fortifications, and lo and behold, we saw lumps of wattle and daub, or burnt daub, and bits of pottery around those medieval fortifications. And so you can conclude, well, isn't that interesting? The ancient Colchians occupied the same places as the medieval fortifications. Well, we hadn't looked anywhere else, because we had started with the medieval fortifications. So what Ryan has done has been a program of, as I say, intensive survey, looking at the other areas, and he has found evidence for habitation, but as I say, much more smaller scale and dispersed. So, starting just from the archaeology of this one particular region, there's nothing about the archaeology that says we're dealing here with a state-level society. The archaeology, is more consistent with, Pache, my former colleague Norm Yaffe, a chiefdom sort of society. The other thing that has been extremely useful has been the way that the way that we have shown the utility of geophysical prospection in investigation of sites identified on the basis of surface survey. And we were very successful at Chuamto. We were less successful at a number of other sites. And it's very clear to us that if there is a whole lot of burnt daub lying around, that's a good place to do your survey. If you're finding pottery and other artifacts without burnt daub, you're less likely to find, pit features and the other kinds of things that the survey might detect. Interestingly, although there have been lots of excavations, small-scale excavations, at some of these regional sites, they had never succeeded in identifying features before. They had only dug what they call cultural layers, or what Americanist archaeologists would call sheet layers. And it's not hard to dig a hole and find in these places where you see pottery on the surface, more pottery under the surface. It's harder, of course, to find features, and the burnt daub is a clear indication of that. So our hope is that when our project is published, which our hope is that will be soon, and it'll be a joint publication, Georgian-American publication. As I said before, we're completely dependent on our Georgian colleagues, in part because they can read the Georgian literature, which American archaeologists who parachute in for 3 years cannot control, as well as the Russian literature, and they know the material culture very well. So our hope is that this project will serve in a small way as a template for other kinds of regional investigations, which, if pursued generally in Colchis, could make a difference to how we understand Colchian social organization. So I think I have one more picture just to remind you of where we are. So thank you for your patience. Sure.
Chris has agreed to take some questions. Is that all right? Murphy.
I was wondering how much Russian reorganization of the landscape. I know that they had some pretty dramatic agricultural regimes and water changing water sources and stuff. How much does that affect actually your survey material?
Well, it's not nearly as bad as it is in Armenia. So for us, two things. One is canalization of the Phasis River, so manipulation of the Phasis River, which has obviously changed the flood activity. And then tea plantations in certain regions. So near Pichvinari, for example, there was a big Russian tea plantation. There are some tea plantations in our region too. And the Russians did have a program of trying to develop this region for tea cultivation, which has been abandoned since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But that's it. I mean, that's the only large-scale, agricultural intervention in this region, and then of course the canalization of the river.
Yes, two questions. First, this fascinating site of Vani. You mentioned this monumental architecture there. Were you able to confirm the existence of a sanctuary or temple there? Because you found and showed this inscription, which apparently is a sort of a sacred law.
That's the idea.
And it's very interesting. The question, from what time this inscription is. Looking at the letter forms, I would say something Hellenistic or also, and that would be very interesting to have a sanctuary there, or a temple. Could you confirm whether there is, from the monumental architecture, whether there is a temple or a sacred building?
No,
Not at all.
no. Sadly, I think that because the excavator had this idea about the city, everything was interpreted as temple architecture. So that the one building that I showed you a picture of looks more like a large-scale residence. It has its own its own kind of granary, except in this case it's clearly for the storage of grain. So pithoi that were used not for wine in this case, but for grain storage, and carbonized grain was found inside of them. Lord Kipanidze, interpreted this as a sacred barn.
Mm-hmm.
On the face of it, it makes much more sense to interpret it as a place where agricultural surplus, was stored by the person who was the kind of head man of this settlement. And I think that some of the other structures that were identified as sacred buildings are probably also houses. And I also think that it's quite likely that there's a great deal of evidence for habitation in dugout houses and wattle and daub construction that just hasn't been identified in the. So I'm not persuaded that there's no settlement here.
Was the inscription unearthed at the site? Or?
The inscription does come from the site. The inscription comes from one of the destruction levels at the site, and it's not wouldn't be surprising, of course, if there was a sacred aspect to the character of the site. That doesn't make it a temple city.
And the second question, from the times of Pompeii, I think the area did belong to the Kingdom of Iberia, didn't it? Or can you comment anything on that?
It did. It did belong to the Kingdom of Iberia at various points in its history. But in terms of kind of, you know, the whole question of state formation, I don't think there's any evidence that there was, you know, to use the anthropological phrase, state-level social organization here before the conquest of Mithridates. I mean, I think it's Mithridates who was the first to unify Colchis at that level.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any more?
Yeah, just a sort of a small question. It was interesting. Well, it was a fascinating paper overall, but it was interesting your references to the sort of North American experiences, and because in fact it is totally different. It's not your average Mediterranean environment. But I didn't hear you mentioning, in terms of survey techniques, things like test pitting and shoveling as approaches, which, you know, from the shots that you showed would seem to be the sort of intermediate way of not really, well, perhaps as intensive as you can in many of these environments.
Yeah, well, that's difficult. I mean, so Ryan, you know, clearly for his survey had a program of you know, shovel testing, but that he wasn't able to get permission to do that. So that's complicated. And it's the same way in Turkey. You know, you can do archaeological survey, you know, to your heart's content, but to move earth, you need an excavation permit, which is something quite different. In Georgia, interestingly, while it's very, very loosely regulated in comparison, for example, with Turkey, you do need specific permission for every excavation. Every single trench, anywhere in the country, has to be approved by a board. So we had to do that for our you know, our excavations at Schwanta. So you're right that it would be good to employ those techniques, but that's difficult.
Please join me in thanking, because again,